Thank you very much, Justin. And greetings to everybody. I know we're being joined today by people across the globe because rather famously Poles get everywhere. So I'm going to start today by asking us to put ourselves in the position of Churchill in this photograph and imagining being presented with its impractically large globe. And we're going to take it in our hands and we're going to pretend it's interactive. And we're going to say, Alexa, show me the Polish Armed Forces at the end of September 1944. And immediately we would see lights flitting up across the surface. If we turn it round to focus on Central Europe then, we would see the heaviest concentration of lights in occupied Poland itself. Two armies, the Polish Home Army and Berlin's First Polish Army, would be concentrated around Warsaw, for example. If we zoom out a little bit, we would see other concentrations in Italy, where the Second Polish Corps are currently fighting under General Anders, and in Northwest Europe, where the forces of Maciek and Sosabowski are fighting as part of the First Polish Corps. If we zoom out even further, we would see the trail of planes flying from Italian air bases through to Warsaw. We would see them leaving from British air bases over occupied Europe. We would see the trail of ships and submarines in the Atlantic and the Channel and the Mediterranean. And we see isolated handfuls of Polish airmen training in Canada, of Polish officers in Burma, and these little dots representing the underground network across Europe and North Africa. Now, the point I'm trying to convey is that the scale of Polish participation in the Second World War is just far too vast to encompass in one lunchtime lecture, much as I would like to do so. So I'm going to be focusing today on this one particular group, which is primarily the Polish soldiers, but also the sailors and airmen who reached Britain 1939, mainly 1940. And there will, of course, be the obligatory mention of Wojtek, the bear, if only to avoid the National Army Museum being inundated with complaints. So could I have slide 2, please? So the theme today then is Sikorski's tourist. To explain the context of this phrase, we need to gate crash the Royal Tour of Scotland in March 1941. So the King and Queen visit the Polish army during this tour and the Polish Commander-in-Chief, General Sikorski. Next slide, please. So to quote the late, great Douglas Adams, who is this Sikorski person anyway? First up, he's not the inventor of the helicopter, nothing to do with the helicopter. In 1939 then, the Polish government, as well as the commander-in-chief of the Polish armed forces, withdrew across the border of Romania, intending to reassemble a Polish government-in-exile and army in France. But most unfortunately, the Romanians intern the entire government and the commander-in-chief, and therefore Poland is lacking both political and military leadership at this point. Real political power then passes to General Sikorski in Paris. He's appointed both the new Polish Prime Minister and the Polish commander-in-chief. And then following the fall of France in June 1940, he reassembles the Polish government-in-exile in London. Now, when Sikorski meets the King and Queen in Scotland in March 1941, he explains in French that Joseph Goebbels, the German Minister for Propaganda, had labelled this new Polish army Sikorski's tourists. And at this point, one of the Polish soldiers speaks up in English and says, "Yes, Your Majesty, and very dangerous tourists we are going to be." And the King and Queen smile at this remark. Now, what does Goebbels mean by tourists? What he is sneering at is the rather tortuous journeys taken by the Poles in order to reach the UK. Next slide, please. So to describe this journey, I'm going to enlist the help of this rather dashing young soldier of the Podhalian Brigade, Antoni Riktaj, whose account was discovered in the archives in Breda by my friend Ilsa, and it's close to where he was killed in 1944. When in Scotland, he was set this piece of writing as an English language assignment, and it's entitled My Journey from Poland to Scotland. So God bless that teacher. Next slide, please. Now, Antoni's account begins, after the war in Poland in 1939, many of the Polish people went away from Poland because they expected it to be slavery for them, or the prison camp in Germany or Russia, and hard work. He means forced labour. And also I did the same, and I had left my motherland on 4th of December 1939, and I went through the frontier of Hungary. Now from Hungary, Riktaj then travels to Yugoslavia, and then he takes a boat to France, where the Polish army has been rebuilt by Sikorski. By May 1940 then, this army consists of 2 full divisions, 2 in the process of being formed, Maczek's own 10th Armoured Cavalry Brigade, and the Battalion Brigade. And it's part of this Battalion or Highland Brigade that Riktaj joins and is then sent to Narvik as part of the Norway campaign. And then he arrives back in France from Norway in June 1940. Now, anyone with a cursory knowledge of the Second World War will know that France is not a particularly great place to be in June 1940. It's weeks after the invasion by Germany. Theme today then is Sikorski's tourist. To explain the context of this phrase, we need to gate crash the Royal Tour of Scotland in March 1941. So the King and Queen visit the Polish army during this tour, and the Polish Commander-in-Chief, General Sikorski. Next slide, please. So to quote the late, great Douglas Adams, who is this Sikorski person anyway? First up, he's not the inventor of the helicopter, nothing to do with the helicopter. 1939 then, the Polish government, as well as the commander-in-chief of the Polish armed forces, withdrew across the border of Romania, intending to reassemble a Polish government-in-exile and army in France. But most unfortunately, the Romanians intern the entire government and the commander-in-chief, and therefore Poland is lacking both political and military leadership at this point. Real political power then passes to General Sikorski in Paris. He's appointed both the new Polish Prime Minister and the Polish Commander-in-Chief. And then following the fall of France in June 1940, he reassembles the Polish government-in-exile in London. Now, when Sikorski meets the King and Queen in Scotland in March 1941, he explains in French that Joseph Goebbels, the German Minister for Propaganda, had labelled this new Polish army Sikorski's tourists. And at this point, one of the Polish soldiers speaks up in English and says, "Yes, Your Majesty, and very dangerous tourists we are going to be." And the King and Queen smile at this remark. Now, what does Goebbels mean by tourists? What he is sneering at is the rather tortuous journeys taken by the Poles in order to reach the UK. Next slide, please. So to describe this journey, I'm going to enlist the help of this rather dashing young soldier of the Podhalian Brigade, Antoni Riktaj, whose account was discovered in the archives in Breda by my friend Ilsa, and it's close to where he was killed in 1944. When in Scotland, he was set this piece of writing as an English language assignment, and it's entitled My Journey from Poland to Scotland. So God bless that teacher. Next slide, please. Now, Antoni's account begins, after the war in Poland in 1939, many of the Polish people went away from Poland because they expected it to be slavery for them, or the prison camp in Germany or Russia, and hard work. He means forced labour. And also I did the same, and I had left my motherland on 4th of December 1939, and I went through the frontier of Hungary. Now from Hungary, Riktaj then travels to Yugoslavia, and then he takes a boat to France, where the Polish army has been rebuilt by Sikorski. By May 1940 then, this army consists of 2 full divisions, 2 in the process of being formed, Maczek's own 10th Armoured Cavalry Brigade, and the Battalion Brigade. And it's part of this Battalion or Highland Brigade that Riktaj joins and is then sent to Narvik as part of the Norway campaign. And then he arrives back in France from Norway in June 1940. Now, anyone with a cursory knowledge of the Second World War will know that France is not a particularly great place to be in June 1940. It's weeks after the invasion by Germany. So his unit heads back to St. Malo, takes the boat to Jersey, and then on to Weymouth, and then the train up to Scotland, where the Poles are regrouping yet again. And then Riktaj ends his assignment with this rather charming note. here in this lovely country, and between so good the Scottish people, we are 1 year and 9 months, and we are getting well all together. Now, there's quite a few points to draw out from all of this. Firstly, the vast majority of the 1 million Poles under arms in September 1939 do not manage to escape from Poland. About a fifth are killed or wounded. Many are taken prisoner, and only about a tenth actually manage to cross the borders into Romania or Hungary or the Baltic states. Many men in the chaos of war became separated from their units and returned home. Many make the decision to remain in Poland to continue the fight underground. Those who sought refuge in the Baltic states would be captured by the Soviets a few months later when they invade. And then in the spring of 1940, we see the massacre of the 10,000 Polish officers at Katyn by the Soviets. Next slide, please. So because of the chaos of war then, the Poles who do assemble in Scotland in the summer of 1940 are very much not a microcosm of the Polish army as it stands in September 1939. And not one stage of the journey from Poland to the UK was easy, except for the actual processing of the Poles as refugees in Hungary. Now, when the British policy of appeasement bought Britain time in 1938 and 39, it had very real consequences on the ground in Central and Eastern Europe. So by the autumn of 1939, the Hungarians are well used to dealing with large numbers of refugees after the arrival of Austrian Jews following the Anschluss, and of Czechs and Slovaks following the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia by Germany, and yes, to a lesser degree, Poland and Hungary. Now, unofficially, the Poles and Hungarians are sort of traditionally friends, and the Hungarians let it be known that they would turn a blind eye to Polish men escaping to France. It actually had to issue a warning to Hungarian civilians not to antagonize their German allies by wearing Polish military attire openly in the streets, because they'd swapped their own civilian clothing for the uniforms of Polish servicemen to allow them to escape. But the majority of Poles end up being interned, and therefore have to, on an individual basis, negotiate their escape out of internment camps and across Europe to French territory. They have to be dressed as a civilian for this, and they need to get their hands on suitably convincing paperwork. One of the most delightful features of all of this is how very quickly the Polish legations, the consulates, start producing this fake documentation. General Maciek, who will go on to command the 1st Polish Armoured Division, describes his own escape from Hungarian internment, and also with that of several of his fellow officers. So, for example, there's a Colonel Dvorak. He had served in the Austro-Hungarian Empire during the war, First World War, sorry. He was fluent in German, and he and his camp commander were actually able to remember that they'd been on a training course together at the same academy during the First World War. So that relationship is built and allows him to escape. There's also a Major Squadrons. Now, he doesn't speak German and he doesn't speak Hungarian. So in order to build up a relationship, he effectively resorts to drinking very, very heavily each night with the camp commander. And this sort of all pays off when they're sat at a bar, and the chief of police comes over to the commander's table and gives him the timing and position of the patrols each night. And the commander then leans over to Squadrons and says, "Perfect, mon ami, but no more than 30 men at a time." Now, how do we then get to France and the Polish camp in Brittany? Next slide, please. Well, planes, trains, and automobiles for the most part, mainly planes and trains. One of the interesting features of these journeys is how very differently different Poles responded to their situation, depending on their age, their responsibility, their experience, their trauma. While in Hungary, for example, many had been able to have some form of communication with their families through the postal service, and they'd been able to read newspapers in a familiar language. And moving on then to France, many men were tortured by the idea of leaving their wives and children behind in Poland. So Sosabowski, for example, who will command the parachute brigade, describes a very somber Christmas Eve among the Polish officers in Paris in 1939. But we also see examples of young men with the opportunity to travel. And almost a lack of urgency in reaching France, though a lot of that's to do with sort of timetables. So several memoirs talk about the men breaking off their journey to visit Italian cities, for example. And we have here a wonderful photograph shared by Peter Konasiewicz showing the Poles at the Acropolis, so actual tourists. These journeys vary significantly, however. Some Poles, including young schoolboys, for example, reach France on foot, having crossed numerous international borders. Others take passage on whatever ship is available, which may well take them via South Africa or Brazil before they reach the UK. Can I have the next slide? Thank you. So the army that finally assembled in France has very little in common with the regular Polish army of September 1939, either in terms of military experience or social background. Firstly, it contains huge numbers of volunteers. We have academics, journalists, writers, for example, from Poland itself, and also people joining from the emigre communities in France and the Americas. And secondly, the nature of the journeys means that chance very much determines who actually reaches France. For many men, it's actually easier to escape to French Syria across the Mediterranean than to take a route to France itself. And then we see the Polish Carpathian Brigade being formed. Next slide, please. So this copy of the Carpathian Brigade song from my grandmother's book of Polish marching songs captures the various journeys taken by the Poles. I will translate loosely and badly, I imagine. It says, we have come here from Narvik. We came through Hungary. We came from Czechoslovakia. Many of us came from Syria. 3 of us escaped from Germany. We came across the sea and from Flanders. We came over the mountains and through the forest. And now here we are all together in Alexandria. Presumably sounds better with music. Next slide, please. Now, Prushinsky, who is a writer who joins the Polish army as a volunteer and is in France and then later Scotland, describes the Polish army as it actually assembles, arriving in dribs and drabs. So he writes, the Polish army formed in France in the winter of 1939 was probably the queerest lot of men that ever carried rifles. There were in the ranks diplomats, including Mr. Lipski, the former Polish ambassador in Berlin. There were also Polish miners from the north of France, some of whom had nearly forgotten their native language. Next to boys of 17 were found university professors of fairly respectable age. There were adventurous volunteers from the Foreign Legion, former legionaries in the Spanish army at Guadalajara, and Polish settlers from Brazil and Peru. Poets, artists, and writers made a small but amusing group. There were priests and there were Jews. It was a kind of Noah's Ark collection with one common feature. They all believed in Poland. Next slide, please. Now, this is all very touching, but the French military authorities and civilians very much did not believe in Poland. For many French citizens, the Poles and their supposed incompetence were the reasons why France had been dragged into an unnecessary conflict with Germany. For the military, Polish failings in everything basic, from tactics and training to equipment, were the reason for their defeat, ignoring Polish descriptions of blitzkrieg tactics and the breakdown of communications, which the French would themselves come to witness at first hand. Now, the Poles then find themselves in the position of all armies in exile. That is, they are dependent on the host country for everything from vehicles and weapons to uniforms and rations. Such basic items as modern rifles, for example, were not released to the Poles. And various memoirs fall over themselves competing to describe the age of the rifles. The majority are content with First World War era rifles. Sosabowski makes a joke about them being from the Franco-Prussian War. And I've seen one memoir that goes as far as identifying them as being Napoleonic. Ancient uniforms are dug out of storage, helmets are in short supply. Maciek discusses trying to train artillery units with sticks, so a small stick for a medium machine gun and a big stick for a heavy machine gun. There is one moment where they do have resources released to them. The Podhalian Brigade and the Highlanders are suddenly equipped with skis and ski suits for the invasion of Finland and have to walk around camp with these. And then when the invasion is called off, they are just widely mocked by their fellow soldiers. Now, when the Germans invade on the 10th of May 1940, the value of the Poles suddenly increases and newer tanks and weaponry are released to them, but it's far too late to overcome the shortcomings of their training. And Sikorski faces an incredibly difficult decision. On the one hand, he wants to rescue the Polish army in order to continue the fight for Poland. But on the other hand, Pétain appeals to him directly, asking him to support the French retreat. Now, General Anders, who's the commander of the Second Polish Corps, writes in his memoirs, he sets out this dilemma that perpetually faces the Polish troops. He says, while the British, American, and other soldiers could concentrate on the purely military conduct of the war, the Polish soldier, during the whole period of hostilities, thought of the final aims for which he was fighting. I shall not exaggerate if I say that hardly a day passed without our thinking of it. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the Polish army in exile could never only be a military force. They always had to focus on the political implications of their existence and judge the fact that they were an army to be the only thing really secure in Poland, a place at the table, even though that would ultimately fail. The fall of France had this huge psychological impact on the Polish leadership, but the Poles very much do not want to be blamed by international opinion for having contributed to France's defeat. So they fight on. But the decision to remain in France until mid-June, when France surrenders, was extremely costly. Of the 85,000 Polish soldiers in May 1940, just a quarter would actually reach Britain in the summer of 1940. Many of the French volunteers sort of returned to their families, but the vast majority of Poles, including almost the entire 2nd Division, were taken prisoner. So we're going to move on and look at how the Poles actually reach Britain. Could I have the next slide, please? So Sikorski flies to Churchill and secures his promise that Britain will continue to fight Germany. And we see the beginnings of Operation Ariel being sketched out. So we're weeks after Dunkirk here. So the plan is for British and French and Polish ships to sail to France's Atlantic ports primarily to pick up the Polish troops who'd retreated to the coast. There's quite a lot of unknowns. They don't know how many men or women would make it to individual ports. They don't necessarily know which ports the British ships will be returning to. They don't know which route to take in order to avoid German attacks, or how significant German planes and German U-boats will present a challenge to actually this operation. So the ships are actually often dangerously overcrowded. They're unarmed. The Poles managed to get a few machine guns onto as sort of, faux anti-aircraft guns, but they're effectively defenseless. And because of the numbers involved, they're relatively short of food and water. And we can see a ship here. Sosabowski describes the conditions on the SS Abderpool, where the journey actually takes much longer than normal because they sail right out into the Atlantic to avoid U-boats. But he also observes that it's on this journey that he learns his first English word, lavatory. It's also here on this journey that many Poles actually first encounter their first Scots. So Pruszyński, in this wonderful book called Polish Invasion, which was republished recently by Neil Acheson, describes this scene on board. Next slide, please. He says the soldier who had just said goodbye to his girl, so this is a French girl who wants him to stay and work for her father, he slips on the gangway and nearly falls into the water, but he's held up at the last moment by a strong hand. As soon as he stood on his own feet, he turned to see his friend. He was a tall blue jacket, red-haired and broad-shouldered, grinning with white teeth. Polish, good, good. I am not doing the accents today. And then showing off, Polish, dobra. And he produced some cigarettes. The Poles, not to be outdone, searched for some English words and said, Englishman, good, good. He was amazed to see the British sailor wagging his head in earnest, good-natured denial. No, no Englishman, Scottish, Scotsman, Scotland. There was great surprise. The Pole, a village boy from Sandomierz, could not understand it at all. Each knew very little about the other, and what they knew was often untrue. The one took the other for a kind of Englishman and was rewarded by being taken for a kind of Russian. Next slide, please. So we now need to turn to the poor old British War Cabinet in July 1940. Not only has it had to come to terms with France's defeat, with Dunkirk, with the prospect of German invasion, but it also has to address the very real logistical problem of all these exiled armies having recently arrived in Britain, of which the Poles were only one example. So what were the priorities? Okay, we're the British War Cabinet. We need to find somewhere for the armies to actually go. It obviously makes sense to keep them in their national units, even though it's reported that the French troops are feeling vaguely murderous towards their officers. We need to find uniforms for them, and we need to feed them, and we need to entertain them because we don't want bored foreign troops marauding around our towns. We also have to give a thought to the poor chaps in the ordnance depot who are working through the equipment and the vehicles and the weapons, and I think it's mixed boxes of ammunition that the various armies have managed to bring over. The French, for example, managed to bring huge bales of French uniforms, so that's not a problem. The Czechs have these outdated French rifles that need replacing. We've got a stash of these beautiful little Renault Cheniettes from the Norwegian campaign, which the Poles can use for training in Scotland. And with the Norwegians, we've got enough underpants and boots, but we don't have enough uniforms, so they're going to have to wait for a while. Now, the Poles arriving in England are rather tickled by being served by these smiling British women. They're given tea with milk, which they do their best with. They discard the fish-paste sandwiches at the most polite moment available. But we mustn't downplay the impact on their morale in enduring a second defeat at German hands. And this is then exacerbated by the decision to send them to Scotland. The first Poles that arrive in Scotland could be accommodated in empty schools. But the vast majority are then given these tents in football stadiums and then on lands outside of Glasgow. And a lingering problem faced by the Poles was this accommodation. The bell tents, which the Poles are provided with, were no match for the Scottish weather, and this has a significant impact on morale. We see here a photograph of rather extreme conditions, but it's a genuine problem. Sosabowski comments that it rained continuously and we were all wet through. Compared with France, it was very cold indeed. Now, the tents will eventually be replaced by Quonset and Nissen huts, nicknamed laughing barrels by the Poles. But as one author observes, the majority of soldiers, after becoming acquainted with them, hardly found them a subject for merriment. Now, the weather is not kind to the Poles, but the accommodation that they're given doesn't represent the Poles being undervalued in any way. Yes, the French are given up-to-date huts in Aldershot, Belgian troops are billeted with local families in Tenby, but the sheer numbers of Polish troops make these options impossible. The figures sort of that being bandied around the war cabinet, you've got 900 French soldiers, 450 Belgian soldiers, nearly 20,000 Poles, including the Air Force. So, we're now in Britain. What are the challenges facing the Polish troops? So we're going to start with creature comforts. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, one of the interesting features of the Poles' arrival in Britain is that the British charities and the sort of socialites who usually adopt them as a worthy cause are not quite sure how to respond to them, and the Poles are often quite amused by their response. So, for example, the Poles have uniforms, I mean, slightly battered French uniforms, but they have clothes to wear. Their pay comes through, that's dealt with relatively quickly. So in no way do they think that they personally are charity cases. So we have Pat Waddle, who runs the first aid nurse and yeomanry canteen for the Poles in Brittany and then supports them in Scotland. And she talks about their bemusement at being gifted these socks that have been knitted for them by women in Boston, assuming women. And the Poles' response is, but we already have socks. But these socks are very beautiful socks, and so they offer to pay for them, which then leads to another awkward situation. So the money ends up being donated to the Spitfire Fund. We also see a large number of fundraising activities for Polish refugees by the Scottish Polish Societies, but we also see quite a lot of reference to Polish officers making contribution to Scottish war charities. So they're very much not coming in as a poorer cousin. Where they do have a need, however, is in that huge body of sort of auxiliary organisations and voluntary bodies that sort of attach themselves to units. And the Poles are short of these. There is a wonderful photograph I forgot to include of a Polish woman darning socks for these very grateful men. But at the beginning, there's no more than 1,000 Polish women in Britain, though that number will increase. So the British organisations need to step in. Now, if you read the literature aimed at British officers on how to maintain morale, they discuss things like the importance of leave, a quiet area for reading, regular sport, local women being on hand to darn socks and wash uniforms. So the women of the first aid nurses yeomanry, such as Pat Waddell and Diana Napier, for example, did not just provide medical support. We see the ambulances here that they donate, but they use their privilege as wealthy British women to secure meeting rooms and marquees, and they play a much more significant liaison role. In Diana's case, she goes to Selfridges and loads up her ambulance prior to her trip to Glasgow with radios and chess sets and dartboards and playing cards. And later in the war, both of these women will actually sort of transfer to London and help with Polish men on leave in drawing up itineraries and showing them where theatres are and so forth. Now, on the food front, could you get the next slide, please? On the food front, the less said, really, the better. The Poles do take quite quickly to fish and chips and fry-ups. But, I mean, Sosabowski just sounds despairing in his memoirs. He says, "We were even sent British Army cooks. After a few days, by which time the men were almost on hunger strike, I asked if we could have the raw rations. We were not ungrateful, but my men just could not stomach British food cooked in the British style." So we have here a photograph of Poles peeling potatoes, which the British clearly could not be trusted with. Can I have another slide, please? Thank you. On a slight tangent, the Poles in Scotland were also responsible for introducing the Scots to the concept of foraging for mushrooms in woodland. Forest mushrooms play a huge role in many sort of Polish dishes. Jadwiga Harasowska, who's based in Glasgow, describes how when we came here first and told our Polish friends that we were going to look for mushrooms, they regarded us with popping eyes. By the autumn of 1941, however, Scottish attitudes towards mushrooms have changed radically. There's an article in Glasgow Sunday Post reflecting on how our horror of mushrooms has amazed and amused the Poles now living amongst us. And you get a number of articles appearing in Scottish newspapers advising Scots to start using mushrooms to supplement their diets at this time of rationing, but also advising them to grab their nearest pole to act as a guide to the best, presumably safest mushrooms in the region. Next slide, please. Now, mushrooms clearly weren't the only cultural difference between the Brits and the Poles. A guide to etiquette written by a Pole based in Scotland advises them that the British particularly value punctuality, that they will think less of you if you speak ill of somebody behind their backs. And they try to explain with anthropological sensitivity the paternalistic role played by pub landlords within the community of a pub. It also advises Polish soldiers that they will better blend in to Scottish society, or at least avoid mockery, if they avoid some of the more formal elements of Polish formalities, such as the double bow or the heel click, and in particular the kissing of ladies' hands, which he describes as barbaric. Now, all of these guides, however, do acknowledge that hand kissing, that British women were in no way averse to hand kissing as a custom, and the practice very much continued and was staggeringly successful. Next slide, please. Now, one of the most fundamental problems facing the Poles, and this is going to have to be a challenge addressed by the Western Allies generally because of its military implications, is the difficulty with language. The vast majority of Poles were bilingual, at least bilingual, as a legacy of the partitions. So Maciek and Sosabowski, for example, are both fluent in German, and they served in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, for example. And Polish officers would speak French. They speak French pretty well. Time was set aside in the first year of officer training for learning French, and they would be taught by French officers. Interestingly, you also actually have quite a number of Poles who don't actually speak Polish that well, particularly volunteers from France or America or Argentina. What you don't have is a huge number of Poles who speak English. Now, we've already mentioned that Sikorski and the king spoke to each other in French, and that a Polish soldier addressed the king and queen in English, and very dangerous tourists we are going to be. And the reports mention that he's one of a group of 5 Polish soldiers who spoke English, but it doesn't give any indication of how they acquired the language. I mean, he could have been an American Pole, or maybe he'd worked in the Polish embassy in London, or he had studied or worked in the West. We just don't know. But being able to learn English would be vital for Polish morale. I mean, this is going to be their home for a certain number of years. And it's also going to be essential to integrate them into the wider Allied war effort. Next slide, please. So we see English language learning taking various forms depending on the service. So the Poles who go on to fight in the Battle of Britain in Squadrons 303 and 304, for example, have to be very quickly drilled in the vocabulary specific to the mechanics of aircraft and navigation. But numerous references mention that this then leaves them relatively ill-equipped to actually chat up women or chat to other pilots or even to order a pint. Next slide, please. Polish sailors were the first to actually be in action from September 1939 alongside British ships on patrols in the North Sea and convoys across the Atlantic. It wasn't actually that essential for them to learn English because a ship is a relatively self-contained community. But where English was needed was in communicating with the other ships, and for this British signallers were brought on board. So if we look at the communication logs for sort of Błyskawica, for example, or Biskowitz, or bottle of whiskey, God help us, the British and Canadians give this ship, we see reference to ships giving each other different code names depending on the place in the convoy, sort of apple and orange, and sort of sending little messages like good luck with hunting fish, which isn't perhaps too cryptic, but it does require a degree of fluency in English. And later you will see Polish and British signallers training together. Next slide, please. Now, the vast majority of the Polish armed forces in Britain, however, formed the first Polish Corps, and everyday communication was the most pressing concern. So they arrived during the summer of 1940, and we actually see hundreds of Scottish teachers and students giving up some of their summer holidays to give English lessons to the recently arrived Poles. This is using the direct method of, holding up a knife and saying knife, and everybody repeats it. Access to formal English lessons varied from unit to unit, kind of depending on where they were in relation to the local community. Some of them are set in the afternoons after training, some in the evening. Some seem not to have received very many lessons at all. And one of the major challenges was the lack of resources available to help Poles learn the language. There were very few English-Polish dictionaries available, but clearly an increasing demand. So this is from a 1944 edition of an English-Polish dictionary. And we can see the increasingly frantic print runs. March 1940, they're probably thinking there's not much point even continuing with this edition. And then we get April 1940, August 1940, oh dear God, another one again in August 1940. And it eventually sort of slows down once we get to 1942. Next slide, please. Now, many Poles found their own way to learn language. Immersion in the local community, through dating, through friendship. One of them talks about working alongside Brits on an engineering course, for example. One of them, who is fluent in German, learns English through a German English dictionary, so he's using his second language to learn a third, or by working their way through British newspapers. Some families have been fortunate enough to still have hold of their notebooks, and this was shared with me via Facebook very kindly, of the phrases that their fathers used to remind them of common phrases. So, for example, we have, what is your name? What is your favourite colour? So, how do you feel this morning? And give me, please, 3 pencils, which is just such a wonderful record. Next slide, please. So now, one of the further challenges, I think we're on to our 4th by now, facing the Polish Armed Forces is actually how to maintain a coherent identity and morale. One of the most interesting features is that if we picture that globe that we started with all those different lights, was that all of those lights would actually be consciously and purposefully aware of what each other one was doing through the work of the Polish Ministry of Information and the Polish press. So, for example, Arkady Fiedler's novel about Squadron 303 in the Battle of Britain was smuggled into occupied Poland and then printed in secret. And it was possible for children in occupied Poland to read about the fate of other Polish children who had survived Siberia and were now living in India, or about Chapek, the little dog mascot of Squadron 305, who went on bomb runs. Equally, we see editors such as Jadwiga Harasowska in Glasgow, or Glasgow, as Poles pronounced it to rhyme with Krakow. They ensured that in the bilingual class with friendship, or the English language voice of Poland, which we have here, Poles in Scotland could read about what the Polish Carpathian Brigade was up to in Tobruk, or about conditions in occupied Poland. And if we look at this little diary, I bring props today. So this is a 1943 diary of a Pole stationed in Scotland. And we see here how the Polish establishment is trying to reinforce identity through something as benign as a diary. So we've got this little emblem here of the 1st Polish Armoured Division. So he's got divisional identity. But then if we look inside, we've got these couple of columns. Not sure if you can see. One of them is related to major cultural events in Polish history. So, for example, you get Marii Skłodowska-Curie's birth date. And on the right-hand side, you have famous Polish victories in the Second World War, for example. So we can see here on the 20th of September, we see the arrival of ORP Wilk, the submarine, to Britain. And yet, next slide, please. All of this very much conceals the very real divisions and diversity that actually existed among the Polish armed forces in Britain. I think they're trying to create this idea of this homogenous, politically unified mass entirely dedicated to return to Poland, and it's a lot more difficult than that. Poland before the war, for example, has a wide range of political parties, and the idea that the Poles would suspend political opinion in exile is relatively laughable. So Sikorski, for example, is by no means universally popular. He's nearly removed from power at least twice, 1940, for having lost the Polish army in France, and then later when he's trying to maintain diplomatic relations with Soviet Russia. And politically motivated animosity is actually such that individuals are removed to Polish-run detention camps in Butte, for example. A classic example here is Ludomir Rejski, who had commanded the Polish Air Force in early 1939. And he's only actually released when the British officials intervene. He then goes on to actually ferry planes to Singapore. Now, when Sikorski's plane crashes off the coast of Gibraltar in 1943, it kills him and his daughter. There's a British MP on board, and Victor Cazalet, who is this establishment figure who works as the sort of Polish-British liaison. And this immediately leads to a number of conspiracy theories, pointing the finger variously at the British, at the Soviets, but also at Polish factions. You also see divisions between the services. Can I have the next slide, please? So the Polish Air Force, and particularly the fighter squadrons, occupy the majority of column inches in the British press here. We can see on the front of War Illustrated the Sikorski visiting a Polish pilot in hospital. And then we've got a pilot from 303 being sketched by the Polish artist Felix Topolski. But this celebrity status is actually in sharp contrast to the army's perception of the Polish Air Force from September 1939, when they feel that they effectively abandoned cities to the onslaught of the Luftwaffe, and that while they were fighting, they were receiving no air support whatsoever. And you see this bitterness coming through quite a lot of the memoirs. Can I have the next slide, please? We also see divisions between the volunteers and the regular army. So in particular, the education and social class of many of the volunteers far outstrips that of their officers. So two particularly extreme examples would be Józef Lipski, who had been the former ambassador to Berlin, and the rather dashing Prince Marie-Angers Poniatowski, who would be killed in the Northwest Europe campaign. You also, though, have quite a number of students whose university studies, have been interrupted. Could I get the next slide, please? So although the German and Russian persecution of Polish academics obviously gives this sort of strong impetus to rebuilding Polish academia, provision is made for Polish soldiers to study medicine at Edinburgh, for example, or French literature or chemistry, for example, at St Andrews. And this is partly in response to maintaining morale. And as one soldier quoted, he talks about the stupidity of his sergeant and the need to escape the dullness of army routine. Next slide, please. A further significant division, and one which damaged the Poles' reputation in Britain as a whole, was the experience of a small number of Polish Jewish servicemen in the 1st Polish Armoured Division. So, although a third of the pre-war Polish population were from ethnic minorities, a number of Polish political parties had a very chauvinistic definition of Polish nationhood, which then travels to Scotland. And there's one Polish newspaper published in Britain called Jestem Polakiem, which is extremely anti-Semitic. And Jim Wald has described how the position of Jewish servicemen based in Scotland worsens after 1943, when Polish soldiers arrive who had been conscripted into the German army and then captured in Tunisia. Now, the Jewish soldiers then apply for a transfer to the British Army, complaining of discrimination ranging from a failure to be promoted through to physical assaults and fearing for their lives. And both the Polish army and the Polish Jewish community leaders try to downplay the incident. And there is a degree of British hypocrisy here. I mean, at the same time, the British Home Intelligence reports are talking about increased anti-Semitism among the British public. But it's sufficiently serious for Sikorski, who replaces Sikorski as the commander-in-chief, to issue an order of the day, deploring the recent desertion of Jewish soldiers and ordering the cessation of all manifestations of anti-Semitism. Next slide, please. But the single biggest challenge facing the Poles was that of trying to reassert their own strategic priority, which was that of liberating Poland, while still working alongside their allied counterparts. As an army in exile, they face a number of problems. The first is obviously recruitment. Attempts to drum up volunteers in the Americas largely failed. These 4 brothers came from Argentina, and a huge amount of press was generated around them, but they were very, very much not typical. Recruitments only begin to arrive from the Middle East in 1942, and then from Poles liberated from the German army later in the war. The 1st Polish army has barely any reserves, and its age profile is significantly higher than that of the other allies. Alongside this is the issue of what formation to actually take. So although the names of prestigious military units are continued, the Battalion Brigade, for example, there's actually very little continuity in personnel. There's also a huge ongoing debate about what the exact role of the Poles will be. So at the outset, it makes most sense for the Poles to be employed in a coastal defence role, developing the infrastructure of beach defences on Scotland's eastern coast, and then manning those defences. But this is a very static role, and it's very, very far from what the Poles intend. Next slide, please. There's also the difficulty of the profile of the personnel. So surplus officers have to be used to create these cadre units. So Sosabowski's parachute brigade, for example, begins life as the Canadian Officers Cadre Brigade, anticipating all these Canadians arriving in Scotland, which is hardly the dirty dozen image which it seems to have acquired. Surplus officers are also sent to man armoured trains and to train troops in West Africa. And eventually, we see a sort of coherent direction emerging when the Poles are given permission by the Brits to form this armoured division under General Maczek. Now, the availability of Lend-Lease funding and the Polish conviction from 40 that you needed an armoured division to be able to take on the Germans, gains traction. But there's still quite a lot of uncertainty that this is the correct direction among the Polish senior command. So a competition is held to create this new emblem for the division. And it incorporates the wings of Sobieski's hussars, the sort of cavalry shock troops that would go into battle with these huge wings, effectively. So this huge assault. Now, according to Maciek, the choice of this causes nervousness among the senior staff. It's kind of the equivalent of giving your car keys to the Aston Martin to your teenage daughter, and she returns it having drawn racing lines across the bottom of it. Now, Maciek discusses the difficulties in resolving tensions between the different elements of the division. He finally resolves all these arguments over resources and status. And then he's asked to reconstitute the entire division as Allied thinking about the optimal formation of armoured divisions changes over the course of the war. Even at this point, General Anders in the Middle East proposes that the entire Polish army in Britain be transferred to the Middle East for the Italian campaign, which Alan is favourable towards. And one can only imagine the words which Maciek would have used had this plan gone ahead. Now, after this then, next slide please, comes access to resources and training. So the 1st Polish Armoured Division leaves its bases in Scotland to head further south, and the different elements of it go and train in Bovington, for example, and Newmarket and Oxford, and up in Yorkshire. The Poles throughout this period are much more grateful, given their experience in France, that they are given access to things such as lorries early on, and then different forms of tank as they develop. And by the time the summer of 1944 comes around, they have trained alongside the French and Canadians and Brits in Cromwell's and Sherman's. And they crossed the Channel a few weeks after D-Day to join in the Northwest Europe campaign under Canadian command. Next slide, please. But one of the utter tragedies of the Poles during the Northwest Europe campaign was that they are fully conscious of the need to prove themselves on the battlefield in order to advance the Polish cause among the Allies, but this cause has already been lost. So despite their victories at Chambois and Hill 262, and the role they play in liberating towns and cities such as Ypres and Abbeville and Ghent and Breda, and famously fighting under the slogan "For your freedom and ours," the decision of Britain and America to prioritise their alliance with the Soviet Union means that a return to a liberated Poland becomes impossible. Maciek describes the scenes in Holland in February 1945, when his men crowded around the radio cars as the terms of the Yalta Conference were made public. Many of his men no longer had a home to return to. And Maciek describes how the different Allied commanders, Simmons and Crerar and Montgomery, gingerly tried to ascertain whether the Poles would actually continue to fight now that Eastern Poland has been given away and that the whole of Poland has fallen under the Soviet sphere of influence. Maciek discusses how their first priority has always been to defeat Germany, but we can see a very clear contrast then between the 1st Czechoslovak Armoured Brigade, which reaches Prague, and the tanks of the 1st Polish Armoured Division, which will never enter Poland. Next slide, please. Now, the division, once they have taken the surrender of Germany at Wilhelmshaven and May 1945, then spends a number of years on occupation duties in Western Germany, overseeing the welfare of the thousands of displaced Poles that have been liberated from camps. This photograph here shows women who had fought in the Warsaw Uprising, who were then imprisoned at Oberlangen, and they are actually released by the 1st Polish Armoured Division. Next slide, please. Now, at the end of the war, 250,000 Poles were serving under British command. The vast majority of these were not actually the original Sikorski's tourists, but Poles who had survived deportation to Siberia and then joined General Anders' 2nd Polish Corps. We also have a large number of Poles who had been conscripted into the German army and then released. So a difficult decision now faces the Poles on whether or not to return to Poland. British propaganda really stressed this expectation that the Poles should return to rebuild Poland. But as my grandmother said, thank you, but I've already been to Siberia. Half of the 250,000 Poles do return despite this risk. And these include people such as Colonel Skrbinski, for example, who had worked closely with Maciek, both in pre-war Poland and in the division. And he is tortured and sentenced to death for treason in 1952, although later reprieved and rehabilitated. Next slide, please. So around 120,000 men, and then with their wives and children, are allowed to settle in Britain. They move into Polish resettlement camps, which have been relatively recently vacated by American and Canadian troops. And the idea is that they would receive training in English and in various trades in order to facilitate their entry into the British labour market. We can see here Wojtek, the Syrian bear who was adopted by the Polish Second Corps in Italy, and he kind of serves, I guess, in the Italian campaign. And he's in one of the Polish resettlement camps in Berkshire before finding his forever home at Edinburgh Zoo. Next slide, please. Now, the attitude which had greeted the Poles on their arrival in the summer of 1940 had changed significantly by the time this second group of Poles arrives in 46-47. Within a year of the Polish victory at Hill 262 in 1944, a Poles Go Home movement spreads across Scotland. And these meetings are held in places that the Poles look back on particularly fondly, so in St Andrews and Cupar and Peebles. The Poles are now seen as representing a threat, as competition for jobs, and they're seen as immigrants rather than political exiles. And actually, because of this hostility in Scotland, very few of the Poles who'd spent so many years in Scotland actually choose to return there. Moreover, one of the conditions for settling in Britain was that due to pressure from the trade unions, the Poles were not allowed to compete for jobs with British workers. So this meant that opportunities only existed in labour-intensive industries, such as the textile mills. So this is my grandfather here, who ended up working night shifts in a mill in Bradford. Next slide, please. General Maciek himself could, in any other circumstance, have expected to move into politics or more senior command, given his reputation, his popularity, thinking of, sort of move of Eisenhower through to the presidency. But instead, he is stripped of his Polish citizenship by the new communist authorities and settles in Edinburgh. He doesn't receive any support from the British government and instead supports his family by working as a barman until his retirement in the 1960s. And to add insult to injury, the Polish government-in-exile was no longer recognised by the new Labour government after July 1945, and as such, the Polish armed forces who had served under British command were not invited to the victory parade. There is a degree of outcry about this, and the invitation is extended to the Polish Air Force, but they refuse it in solidarity with the rest of their Poles. Next slide, please. Cryptic, I know. So I'm going to end with a particularly beautiful and bonus, easily pronounceable Polish word, which is latarnik, which means lighthouse keeper. There is a novel by Sienkiewicz about a veteran of the 1830 uprising who settles in the USA and as an exile, living by himself as a lighthouse keeper, loses sense of his identity. And a series of Polish novels, however, reignites his sense of self and he rediscovers the Polishness of his soul. In fact, he's so into these books that he allows a ship to crash, but we'll ignore that bit. Now, a study of the Polish community in Britain in the 1950s uses the same term, latarnik, to describe individual Poles living and working in Britain and tethered to their Polish identity by Polish newspapers and Polish books. And right now across the globe, there will be first and second and third generation Polish immigrants for whom none of this is abstract military history, but very much the lived experience of their families. And I am incredibly grateful to Justin and the National Army Museum for allowing me to give an insight into just a small part of that experience. Thank you very much.